Well, hello and welcome everyone to Ringler Radio. I'm Larry Cohen, head of Ringler Associates Northeast Operations, and we're certainly glad you could join us again today. Well, complications stemming from transvaginal mesh and lawsuits by women against the manufacturers, these are other cases of how a defective product can have a huge impact on a life. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar, transvaginal mesh is a type of mesh used to treat pelvic organ prolapses, stress urinary incontinence, and similar problems in women. Basically, the mesh is implanted through the vagina and is used to shore up pelvic organs that have become displaced due to age, childbirth, hysterectomy, or obesity. With the implantation came complications, and the FDA reported that between 2008 and 2010, more than 1,500 reports of problems associated with the devices in the repair of pelvic organ prolapse had been recorded, 5 times more than what the agency received between 2005 and 2007. Of course, this has resulted in litigation, and several multi-district litigation actions have arisen and against these various manufacturers. And we're going to talk about all that today with our special guest. But my co-host today first is Heather Anderson from our Birmingham Ringler office. Heather joined Ringler Associates in May 2009, and prior to joining Ringler, Heather spent 12 years in the structured settlement industry on both the administrative and the consultant level. And welcome, Heather, to Ringler Radio, and glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Larry.
And our special guest today is Leigh O'Dell from the Beasley Allen law firm down in Montgomery, Alabama. Leigh practices in the mass tort section, and her current focus is on product liability actions really involving this subject, transvaginal mesh. Leigh was appointed as a member of the plaintiff steering committee for all 4 multi-district litigations in this area, and she's quite important in this arena. So, Leigh, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's we've got two folks from Alabama on this show. Heather, you're in Birmingham, and Leigh, you're in Montgomery, and I'm sure that the weather down there looks awful good today, right?
Sunny skies in Montgomery and 70 degrees, which is this is really one of the probably 4 weeks of the year we have awesome weather. So it's a terrific break. Terrific break from the heat of summer.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Well, Leigh, we gave a brief overview at the beginning about transvaginal mesh, but let's start with a little more background on the topic from your point of view. Tell us about this whole arena.
Well, it's the advent of these procedures was the early 90s, but we have seen the use of mesh, and it's made of polypropylene mesh used for repair of pelvic organ prolapse and stress urinary incontinence come to the forefront really from 2005 forward, and tremendous number of products were introduced to the market, and many of them now proving to be defective and causing just a tremendous number of difficulties for women. And I noticed in the introduction, Larry, you're talking about the number of adverse events reported to the FDA being in the 1,500 range. That's actually only for the adverse events associated with pelvic organ prolapse, or 1,700 associated with stress urinary incontinence procedures. And it's estimated that that's only 1% of the total number of adverse events that are taking place around the country. So there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of these procedures are done each year. And currently, according to recent literature that's been published, as well as the discovery and litigation, it appears that up to 25% of these products fail or cause adverse events in some manner. And that's everything from erosion, and a lot of people don't know what that means initially, but erosion is when the mesh itself protrudes into an organ. It could be another, like the bladder or another organ, or the vaginal wall, and sometimes it even pierces or perforates those organs and causes a lot of difficulty.
Well, I think we're going to talk about some of that in a minute, but
sure.
All of these numbers you're mentioning, I'm sure, come as a surprise to a lot of folks out there. I don't think many people think about the complications from these procedures, from these issues. Was all this a surprise to the legal community as well, or did it come on rather suddenly? All these issues surrounding transvaginal mesh, or was this a long simmering problem?
I think it's been a long simmering problem, and because of the increase in the number of procedures using mesh, we're seeing a lot more women with difficulties, and I think for several years, doctors were unsure what was causing some of the pain, the chronic infection, the painful intercourse that women were experiencing, and they did not associate it with the mesh. But last year, in July of 2011, the FDA issued a bulletin, which is quite rare for them to do this, and in the context of pelvic organ prolapse or POP procedures, they basically said the serious associations with the serious adverse events associated with the surgical mesh are not rare, and the effectiveness is not known, and more traditional procedures should be considered. And when I say traditional, that's referring to suture-based procedures that have been used for many years to repair these issues with women without any of the serious complications.
That's it's very, very interesting.
Leigh, are you finding that women are requiring surgery to remove the mesh, and are we looking at multiple surgeries here, or what are some of the ways that they can that this can be cleared up?
Well, because many women are having to have surgeries. If they're having difficulties with the mesh, they're requiring either, and some of the procedures are more minor. They can be the clipping, but for most of our clients, they've had major surgery to try to remove the mesh. And because the mesh breaks down inside the body, that removal is very difficult. And so this results in a woman having multiple procedures, and oftentimes at the end of those procedures, she still has mesh remaining in her body.
So there's a long-term impact from the removal aspect of all this on the women. Tell us about how it's affecting them, even psychologically.
Well, for many women, particularly those who had the procedure, and maybe they weren't having great difficulties at that point, and they have the procedure that's supposed to repair this minor problem, and all of a sudden they have chronic pain, chronic infection, they have incontinence and painful intercourse. All these things obviously have huge emotional and psychological effects on a woman. Depression, even the chronic pain alone. And some of our clients, as I've talked to them, they've just shared how to be in pain all the time, it is a huge emotional and psychological weight, and they've had great difficulty. And then even post-removal of the mesh, they continue to have pain because of the damage to nerve endings in such a sensitive area of the female body, as well as scar tissue that develops because of the surgery. So you could have permanent incontinence, chronic pain, and you can imagine all the impact that has not only on your sexual relationships, but also just in life, how you handle all the things that women are required to handle. It can be a very difficult situation.
It's just tragic. I mean, truly. Well, let's talk litigation. The U.S. Judicial Panel on Multi-District Litigation recently granted motions creating MDLs against 3 of these transvaginal mesh manufacturers. And can you tell us a little bit about that, Leigh?
Sure. There are actually now 5 MDLs. The barred MDL has been ongoing for about 3 years. It's the most mature consolidated litigation, I would say, in the federal system. And they're now there's an MDL for American Medical System products, Coloplast, Boston Scientific, and Johnson & Johnson. And there's also some state court consolidated litigation around the country as well.
What are your thoughts on centralizing the litigation? Has it been a good move? What do you see as the pros and cons of doing that?
I think by far the pros outweigh the cons for women that are having these problems because of the massive nature of the discovery that's necessary because of the similar issues across cases, having it's really not a small number. It's about 7 courts handle a lot of these issues. Just helps progress things across the course of all litigation, all cases. And whereas if you had these cases peppered around federal courts throughout the country, and they would be in all 50 states as well as state courts, you would find that you'd have so many inconsistent decisions. It would be very hard to advance the claims of the women as a whole, but even individually, it would be very hard to resolve them and litigate their rights in a way that would be effective. So MDLs, I think, are a great thing, but also there's just a state court litigation in New Jersey as well as Minnesota and California, and those are also consolidated for particular defendants.
Well, Leigh, tell our listeners a little bit more about how the FDA has been alerted to this. How far back do these reports about problems go? Talk a little bit about, during this discussion, talk a little bit about some of the complications arising again that we touched on earlier. You mentioned erosion, and what about organ perforation, pain, and the infections? So these issues have arose over time, and the FDA has been aware. How far back are these reports, and have there been any recall notices out there?
Well, the products were placed on the market. Some of the earlier versions of these products were placed on the market in the early 90s. And there have been problems reported since then. But as we know, adverse events are not reported often to the FDA in post-market adverse events. And so the FDA became focused on this issue in 2008 when there was just such a large increase in the number of adverse events. As I see the problems related to the FDA, it is the approval process. All of these products, in large measure, were not subject to pre-market testing. They were approved and placed on the market through the 510K process, which does not involve pre-market testing. And the mesh that is used in these products was actually used for hernia repair. And they decided maybe it would be a good idea to use them in POP and SUI repair. And we all know, the female anatomy is far different in the in the reproductive tract than a hernia. And so it's astounding to me, actually, that these products were approved by the FDA under that procedure, the 510K procedure, and not subjected to any pre-market clinical testing. And I think that's something that needs to change, because had it been subject to the testing, I'm not sure these products would be on the market. And some of them, from design to implementation into a commercialization process, the time period was as short as 45 days. And I find that to be, shocking. So bottom line is, Larry, to answer your question, there have been some recalls by J&J and AMS, American Medical Systems, another manufacturer. And I suspect you're going to see additional recalls in the future. Well,
that's interesting. And, just as a editorial comment on your part, do you think part of the FDA's lack of this approval process back then, is it your opinion that it was because it was more of a female issue, or do you think it was just an overall lapse on their part?
Well, the 510K procedure is used for medical devices across the medical field. So in that sense, the use of that procedure for approval of these products is no different than some of the other medical devices that we've heard about in the past. But I will say, if I could offer this from a female perspective, I'm not sure that if this were a type of procedure that was used in the male anatomy, that it would have been done as long as it has been. I
sort of expected that answer. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
I don't want to cast aspersions on your gender, Larry.
I think his
opinion.
history has kind of shown that to some degree, what you're saying is probably more right than wrong. Well, Leigh, you were appointed as a member of the plaintiff steering committee for all of these MDLs, and I understand there are 5 MDLs now, by Judge Goodwin. Tell us about your role on the committee and your reaction to what is evidently a high honor.
Well, I would say I feel extremely honored to be included in a group of lawyers that are providing leadership to the litigation on the plaintiff side, and it is a Hall of Fame group, and I don't feel actually that I feel very honored to be mentioned in that group, and humbled for sure. And my role will be to assist in providing leadership for the discovery and some of the sort of the legal briefing aspects of it, and because the group we have 5 MDLs, and there's really a lot of different areas to cover. My focus is on actually one particular defendant, American Medical Systems, and as well as some others. But on the MDL, that's how we're divided, and I'm very excited about being involved in that group.
And just for our audience, how important is the steering committee in pushing this litigation forward as you go down the road? I'm sure it's a time-consuming process, and it's an expensive process. How do you handle that?
Well, it is time-consuming, and it's the functioning of the plaintiff steering committee is critical to advance the litigation for the benefit of those who've been victims of this particular defective product. And so it's critical that there's vision, leadership, and execution. And in each of these MDLs, millions of documents will be produced, hundreds of depositions will be taken, and always with the eye on effectively arriving at a point where these cases can be tried. And so, and it's a great committee, and I look forward to the work in the months and years ahead.
Great.
Well, Leigh, clearly you're knee deep, with this litigation, and obviously kind of at the heart of it all, and have a lot of contact with the individual cases of the women that have been affected. What types of women is this affecting? Can you tell us a little bit about that, or some real life examples of some folks you've been working with?
I'd love to. One of the surprises to me as I began to talk with clients is that the age range is quite young. I mean, I think initially when I heard that women were having POP procedures, pelvic organ prolapse procedures, like a bladder had prolapsed, I thought that was for older women. And but what I've learned is that many of the women who've suffered adverse events actually are in their late 30s, 40s, young 50s, and what they thought was a very simple and minor procedure to correct a problem like stress urinary incontinence, which was not life-altering for them, they now have problems that will follow them the rest of their lives. And they're young and otherwise had been very active women. So we see a range of women from late 30s on up into the 70s and 80s, but there's a tremendous number of women that are in that 40s and young 50s range, which was surprising to me. I think, for example, of a client who was having, she had a she was in need of a pelvic organ prolapse procedure, but was really having no pain. She did have a cystocele, which is a bladder that had dropped some, and And so she was preparing to have that procedure, and as she was talking with her physician, he suggested that she also have an SUI mesh procedure as well, because many women do have stress urinary incontinence, and she wasn't having any grave difficulties, but her doctor suggested it, so she had the procedure, and that started a 2-year cycle of pain, infection, and the pain was not only pelvic pain, but because of the needles that are used to implant the mesh, there was pain in her that they go through a very nerve-rich area that affect the legs. She had pain in her legs. She could barely walk some days. And she's now had 2 surgical procedures to remove the mesh. And you can imagine, it's been now 3.5 years. And in addition to the pain, just the effect it has on your marriage relationship and other issues has been really challenging. But this client, she was in her very young 50s and had been in otherwise great health. And I think of another client who, with tears, shared with me that she had the procedure when she was 39 years old. She had a child within 2 years of the procedure, and just had sort of was at the point of finishing her family, and she had some excess weight due to the pregnancies, very familiar situation, and doctor recommended the SUI procedure, and so she had it, and now she has had 3 surgeries actually, has permanent incontinence and painful intercourse, and she's in her young 40s. And so it just breaks your heart when you think, and here's the issue, that traditional surgical procedures are often equally effective without the danger of these complications. Yeah. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why is mesh being used? And it certainly seems that in many instances, maybe not all, but in many instances, the risk far outweigh the benefits.
Well, Leigh, why don't you describe just quickly again to bring this full circle? What exactly is the mesh, and what is it made of, and why are we causing all these complications from it?
Well, when you think of mesh, some people have the mental image of, say, like surgical gauze, something that's really malleable, soft, but that's really not the right picture. The right picture is a woven mesh using fishing wire, and it can become hard and brittle, and it's like almost sandpaper in the body, and causing such pain. And so for women that have had these procedures and they are experiencing whether it's a chronic infection, they're just having serial urinary tract infections and they don't know why, and maybe their doctor hasn't associated mesh, or they're having pain even down their legs or painful intercourse and don't know why, then if they've had a mesh-based procedure like a stress urinary incontinence or a pelvic organ prolapse procedure, I would urge them to see a urogynecologist and to find out if in fact the symptoms they're experiencing are associated with the mesh, either protruding into an organ like the bladder or the rectum, or possibly eroding into the vaginal wall. Well,
there's no question that women are going to be exploring, especially those who hear about this, are going to be exploring those options for themselves and trying to find the root cause of all that. Before we go, Leigh, we're constantly hearing stories like this, complications arising out of medical devices and oftentimes pharmaceuticals. What do you say needs to change out there, whether it's FDA approval processing or whether it's just manufacturers being a little more cognizant of the impact of what they're producing? What is the main thrust of what you see has to change in order to prevent some of these incidents?
I think two things I would suggest is a complete reformation of the approval process. for medical devices. Medical devices have not gotten the same kind of attention, it seems, from a pre-marketing clinical testing perspective as, say, some of the drugs have. And I believe that process of putting a device on the market, only using a 510K process, needs to be revisited at the sort of the regulatory level. And I think second to that, what we're seeing is that manufacturers had significant amount of information about the true rate of adverse events among women who had mesh-based procedures. And that information was not being conveyed accurately or thoroughly to physicians who were using the products. And I think that needs to be addressed in order to prevent this in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a problem that's needs to be corrected. I think there's some political implications in all of that, and perhaps philosophies. Perhaps part of it is lobbying efforts, et cetera. But it's a big problem, and I know that a lot of the litigation that's arising out of these cases is helping to formulate some of those corrective actions.
Well, litigation in this instance, I'm very hopeful, as well as some others, but here that because of some of the way this has been handled by the medical device manufacturing industry, that maybe that this litigation will hold them accountable for some of those decisions, and for women who've had these products and are having these issues because of what was known and what was not conveyed to the medical community as well as to patients. Women, I would encourage women to explore their legal options in relation to the product. Well,
there's no question about that, and I think anyone listening today that wants to explore those legal options has a place to go, and that's clear to you. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, Leigh, how would they do that?
1-800-898-2034, and then we're on the web, www.beasleyallen.com, and my email address, is there, and we'd love to talk with any woman about what they've gone through and how we might be of assistance to them.
Great. And Heather, if someone wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
I can be reached at my phone number is 205-915-8399, or you can always go to the Ringler website and find me there, have H. Anderson at ringlerassociates.com.
Well, that's very true, and you can reach any Ringler Associate on ringlerassociates.com. I encourage you to go to the website. It's recently been redesigned. It's got a lot of great information. And you can also listen to Ringler Radio shows by accessing ringlerassociates.com and clicking on the Ringler Radio link. We've had literally hundreds of shows on a lot of great topics, just like this one, and with some great guests like Leigh O'Dell. And Leigh, I want to thank you again for joining us. Good luck in your processing and prosecuting of these cases. It's a lot. You're working on behalf of a lot of women out there, I'm sure, that need the help in this instance. So good luck to you.
Thanks so much. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you. And for the rest of you out there, I just want to say go out and have a great day. Thanks.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.